Off the top, I am excited to announce that the Steam page is now live for my game Paradox Patrol. I didn't mention it in the last video, but I have made the decision to turn it into a full game. So if you guys have liked what you've seen by the end of this video and you want to support the game, go over there and give it a wish list. Link will be in the description. Welcome back for Devlog 2. In the first devlog, I went over how I created the 360 Sidescroller, and in this devlog, I'm going to talk more about the game itself and how I came up with the concept. If you haven't seen the first devlog yet, I highly recommend checking it out. It did way better than I expected, and it was really fun getting to read through all of your comments. There were a lot of really nice and supportive comments, as well as a fair amount that were more skeptical, and I totally get that. I want to properly address all of your feedback, but I feel like that could be an entire video by itself. So I'm going to address the most common skepticism at the end of this video, but then I'll make a separate video going through each one of the recommended games, and we'll give them a fair shake. So with the system built, it was time to finally design a game around it. The one thing that I knew going into it was that the gameplay genres were going to evolve over time, but I felt like I needed a good reason for why the gameplay should evolve. As much as I love games like Nier Automata, where the gameplay style switches in the game, there really isn't a good reason for why it switches other than, well, it's a video game. And my favorite games are ones that tie in their mechanics with the story and the world so it all makes sense in universe. So I asked myself, what's actually happening when the gameplay switches? Well, it's shifting the dimensions, which then made me ask, but would be powerful enough to bend reality like that? And then it hit me. Paradoxes. We've all seen paradoxes explored in sci-fi movies and TV shows before. Most of the time they center around time travel because those are the most popular ones. Like the grandfather paradox, where it asks, if you went back in time and killed your grandfather, would you then cease to exist because your father would never have been born? One of my favorite paradoxes comes from the show Doctor Who, where the Doctor's TARDIS, or a spaceship, is bigger on the inside than it is the outside, and that's a good example of a spatial paradox. So I thought, okay, well, what if paradoxes were a common occurrence in my game's universe? Some would occur naturally, and others would be caused by artifacts that have the power to alter reality itself. If that were the case, then there would of course be those who'd seek out its power to use it for evil or for control. And naturally, there would be an opposing side, ones that combat the evil to prevent paradoxes from tearing apart the universe. Some kind of galactic law enforcement to keep things in check. Some kind of... There it was. The concept for my game had finally come into focus, and with an actual treasure trove of different paradox concepts to pull from, I was beginning to get really excited about the possibilities of where I could take the game and what cool gameplay mechanics could be explored. Feeling really inspired, the story for the game just began pouring out of me, and here is the synopsis. In the game, you play as Paradox Patrol Officer Conway. While out on a routine patrol of the galaxy, his ship detects a signature of a paradox. He decides to go investigate and track down the source coming from the planet Cygnus B. Aided by his trusty companion Theo, he journeys towards the source, encountering hostile indigenous alien life and discovering the remains of an ancient alien race. As he ventures closer to the source, strange and unexpected bursts of radiation begin to emanate from the source, each time elevating the threat level and altering the dimensions of reality. This is where the gameplay genre changes. At the heart of the disturbance is Magnus, an intelligent alien who has tracked down a powerful artifact, a remnant of the planet's long-lost civilization. He is the one that's responsible for the dimensional shifts, and he's used the artifact to open up a dimensional rift and is attempting to ascend through the dimensions to achieve godlike power. Okay, so that's the setup. Now it's time to actually start building the game. The first thing that I did was begin coding in additional mechanics that I want to have inside the game. I had the rifle implemented, but I didn't want to make the player play through the entire game using just the rifle, so I decided to add in some grenades. The tossing mechanic was simple enough to set up, but I knew that the player would need to be able to see where they're throwing them at. So I added in a visible prediction arc that you can aim the same way that you aim the rifle, And after doing some testing, I realized that if you're fighting in a darker area, the grenade could become hard to keep track of visibly. So I added in a blinking light to the grenade to let you know where it's at, as well as a countdown beep so the player has an idea of when it's going to explode. The next thing I added was the grapple hook. When I played the game Returnal, one of my favorite mechanics in that game was the grappling hook, and I thought it was cool because it added some good verticality to the levels, and it also made for some really fun traversal. So I knew that I wanted to have one in my game as well. And this was definitely a good challenge for me because I've never made a grapple hook mechanic before. But with a good amount of failing and experimentation, I managed to get it feeling just right. And with the added sound effects, it feels super satisfying to zip up to a ledge and then flip down to the ground. With the player mechanics done, I moved on to what I knew was going to be the hardest challenge by far, and that was the enemy AI. Because I had created a system where the player character can change genres, that would also mean that I'd need to give the enemies the ability to switch genres as well. And I was like, oh man, what have I gotten myself into? But I began by creating the master AI blueprint with the core logic, and began converting my character movement code that I made for the player character to work for the AI. So it took a good bit of experimentation, but after 2 days I managed to finally get it working, and now the AI could move and switch genres just like the player can. But then a crazy idea popped into my head. Since Magnus controls the artifact, what if, during the boss fight, he could force Conway to switch between genres as a combat advantage? He could lock the player into a side-scroller temporarily, and then Magnus, since he still has his full freedom of movement, could attack from any angle, and the player would just have to survive his onslaught long enough until he releases him. It was at this point I started to think, damn, I might actually be onto something special here. One of the things that was brought up the most often was, this is just a third-person shooter with a fixed camera. And I think there is a common misconception of what defines a third-person shooter and what defines a fixed camera. What I want to ask is, what criteria is needed to make a third-person shooter a third-person shooter? Is a third-person shooter defined purely by being able to see the character in a third-person perspective while playing and have the ability to shoot? Well, we can quickly rule this one out with a few examples. For instance, we could use this criteria to describe a Metroid game. We clearly can see the full body of the character from a third-person perspective, and we can obviously shoot with the character as well. We can also even use the original Resident Evil game as a good example. Is the character viewed from a third-person perspective? Yes. Can you shoot with the character? Also yes. But true fans of the game would actually get offended if you called it a third-person shooter. This style of gameplay is known as its own genre, which is survival horror. To add to this, when someone says a game has a fixed camera system, this is what they're typically referring to. A fixed camera is, well, fixed, or locked to a static location, and it remains stationary while rotating towards the character. So then if neither of these define a third-person shooter, then what does? Third-person shooters, as what has become most accepted, can be defined by playing the character from a third-person point of view with a rotatable camera that is positioned over the shoulder. In fact, although Resident Evil 4 isn't the first third-person shooter, it's the game that helped popularize the genre, and its mechanics help define what a third-person shooter is. But then I want to also ask, what criteria is needed to make a side-scroller a side-scroller? Is a side-scroller defined purely by locking the character to a plane and only allowing movement from left to right? Or is it defined by the level design and the flow in which a level is supposed to be played through? Or is it the positioning of the camera and how it faces and flows perpendicular to the flow of the level? To be fair, the gameplay I showed in the first devlog was a little bit out of context for how it actually plays in the game. Even though the character is allowed to move into the scene on the x-axis, the levels are designed to be played from left to right, and the camera always remains perpendicular to the flow of the level. So, given this criteria, I don't think you could in good faith say that it isn't a side-scroller. If we take all this into consideration, combined with the system's ability to aim and shoot towards the camera, which third-person shooters can't do by definition, I think we can safely take third-person shooter with a fixed camera off the shelf.